Hey guys, here we are again at talking about coaching, and I'm here with Sivash and Yannick. Hey guys.
What's up, Nikki? So good to have you back.
Thank
Hey,
you. It's good to be back. Cool guys. So we've got some lovely questions today, and this one I'm super interested in. The question is self-disclosure. Am I sharing too much or too little when I am coaching? Great
Hmm.
question. What are your
Well,
thoughts,
I,
boys?
I get that question a lot because I think traditionally in coaching schools they teach you not to disclose anything of yourself. Like your opinions don't matter. You go with the client. You really focus in on the client. The client is the most important person. And whenever you share something of yourself, you're kind of leading the client. You're influencing the client, and coaches shouldn't be doing that, right? And then coaches realize that when they do share something of themselves, often clients really appreciate it. I mean, if you only talk about yourself, obviously that's not really helpful. But these little blimps, I don't know, somebody's asked you, how's your day been? And you share a little bit about yourself. You give yourself personality, right? In marketing, when coaches are out on social media, when they write blogs, they often tell personal stories. And that's often the thing that resonates with clients, that feels like a human to human connection. And given that coaching is such a relationship based practice, I think it's quite important that we have this human to human connection, and that I am a person with personality and values and beliefs, right? And I really get that that can also really be in the way, right? Because now they know what I'm thinking. I can no longer work with projections, for example, right? The traditional therapist or analyst, they don't disclose any information about themselves, and they're very, very careful of not doing that. Because if you're a blank canvas and the client doesn't know anything about you, then if they think you're a good parent, then that's not me. That's their mind being projected onto me. So that tells me a lot about them. Whenever they think something about me, and I've been very careful not to disclose anything about me, then I can work with that because they're telling me about themselves as they tell me how I'm like, as they make assumptions about how I am. That's their mind. That's not how I am. So as soon as I self disclose, I lose that way of working. But I'm also building a stronger human to human connection, which, I don't think there's generally a better or worse. There's just very different ways of working. And within that, I think there's thresholds. But I think as a foundation, that's something important for me that I wanted to say.
Hmm. Really cool. It just made me think like, do you have a personal example of a time maybe when you shared something and how that kind of supported the session?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, I'm quite open and transparent when I work, right? So if somebody says, "Hey, so how are you?" I listen in, and I usually tell them how I am. For example, just 2 days ago or something, somebody asked me, "Oh, how are you?" And I said, "Well, my daughter's been ill this week, and we've been, we've not been sleeping that well. Stuff goes on in the nursery. A couple of illnesses are going around, so we just came back from the doctor, and thank God it's not one of those more serious illnesses, but just a viral infection. And I had one of those mornings where this happened and this happened, and now I'm here. I'm feeling good. I'm excited for this session, but I can feel some of that stuff going on, right? I can feel some of the exhaustion, not to a point where I'm not present, but there's a little bit of that sensation in my body going on right now, you know. And more often than not, they resonate with some of that, and they tell me maybe something around their parenting, or they tell me something about what it's like or what's going on in their body. In a way, I'm being a role model of checking in at that moment because I'm listening in. I'm telling them about some sensations that are going on in my body. I'm making some connections between this, that, or the other. And they might follow, right? They might then listen in. And they might not tell me how their week's been when I'm asking them what's present for you as you're tuning into this, but they might tell me what's happening in their body right now, and how their state of mind is at the moment. Um, so that's just kind of one of those examples. The other day I was telling them that we've been planning holidays, thinking about going to Greece. And then they were telling me about their Greece holiday from a couple of years ago. And there was a really significant story in there that was very much related to what was going on in their coaching at this time. and an illustration of how they were relating to one of their team members at work. This fear of the unknown, and how in Greece that didn't really matter so much, because they were just kind of free and following and kind of being quite okay with seeing what's going to happen today. But at work, they really needed to know exactly what's going to happen. So if I hadn't mentioned Greece, maybe that story wouldn't have come up. And this was direct access to, I can actually be really comfortable with not knowing. How can we use that and transfer it into work? Why is that so different? So it really just opened something up that maybe otherwise might have taken much longer, because they hadn't made a connection between me at work and me in my private life. So I'm a big fan of just tuning in, being present, being quite transparent. If it shifts into more focus on me than on them, then I'll usually pull the brakes. But I allow some of that to happen, because more often than not, there's something in there, or at least it's worth a try, or it's just a connection and it's just not a relevant story. There's not always a link.
Yeah, super interesting. What were you say, Vash?
Well, first of all, I think it's a really good question. And for me, I think what comes up is there's two parts. One is, I think, what Yannick mentioned, that kind of like at the start of the session, and then there's like during the session. I think there's almost like two different types of sharing. And I think especially with the second part, where I want to really slow down to, like, is this useful? Is this useful, in terms of, is it going to serve the client? And I want to really slow down to, why am I sharing this? Right? On the first part, it's a little bit, again, just for me, what comes up, like the context is different, the intention is a little bit different. And I feel also like, just looking at my past experience at the sharing in the first part, there was a good few years where I wouldn't share anything in the first part. So when a client asks, how are you? I'm like, yeah, I'm good. Right? Because I didn't want to make it about me. And I've noticed that, that if I I've noticed, for example, with people when they share, I can notice, for example, with Yannick, like, he has a lot of experience, he knows how to hold the space, and he's done the work on himself, right? And I've seen with others, and I've seen this even in myself in the past, where I share at the beginning, and there's almost like a slight role reversal that happens, right? Because the coach in that time, like, and this has happened to me a long time ago, it's I'm not that, I share, but then I'm sharing something that's present in the moment, and I'm losing a little bit of that presence in the session, and what the session is really about. And sometimes that's even okay, like if it's really, so for example, even a year ago, something happened in my personal life that was really present, and there's a lot of strong emotions, and I thought, you know what, I've been working with this client for a while, let me just share. But as I shared it, the emotions were stronger than I expected, right? But I think here, in this case, because I have the experience and skills, I was able to shift back into, like, okay, I appreciate you holding a little bit of space, and I was talking about it. Now I'm good to go. Let's focus on you. Let's focus on the session, right? But yeah, so that's what's coming up for me initially. It's like there's two parts. One is kind of being really honest and vulnerable, or being just in the moment, and which kind of gives also permission for the other person to be real. And I just, say like, yeah, I'm good.
I'd love to jump in this, Ivish, because I think this is really important. And thank you for sharing this, because when a coach shares something that feels quite vulnerable, I remember a couple of moments when I shared something that was really quite vulnerable, and I shared it not just because it was super present for me. Like, Brené Brown has that thing about share your scars, not your wounds, right? If you share something that is an open wound right now, and it can be tricky, and it can be a bit awkward, because what happens at that point? If you haven't quite made sense of this and it's all coming out, it might be a bit awkward for the client, because this is time that should be focused on them. And if we open up to a point like that without a clear link to what they're currently working on without a clear reason why I'm sharing this. If I'm sharing this just because it's very present for me at the moment, it can feel awkward, but it might also be important, right? Because if there's something that's going on right now that makes me be a bit different today, maybe a bit more contemplative or a bit more, silent, or, if I'm going through something that they notice I'm a bit different today, I think it's important that we acknowledge that, because then the client isn't thinking, why are they different now? Or what is it about me today? It's got nothing to do with you. It's just, this is happening in my life. You might notice this. Maybe if a phone call comes through today, I might need to take it because my wife is currently in the hospital. Don't worry about it. It's pretty standard. But if a phone call comes through, I will need to take it. It'll just be a moment. And yeah, I notice a little bit of nervousness, even though it's standard procedure. But like, I'm fine to do the coaching session. But if you notice something a little bit different about me, that's probably that little bit of tension in the back, thinking that, there's still a little bit of risk left. In my experience, when you're not showing something like that, clients really appreciate that you open up to them, because it also means you trust your client to a point where you disclose something that feels quite vulnerable, right? So read your client a little bit, right? Some clients, they might really not appreciate that because it should be about them. And other clients, they really appreciate that because they want to connect on a human level on that person in front of them. And that can make the coaching so much better going forward. But yeah, is that processed already? Is it fresh? I mean, it's a complex thing, right? Nikki, super curious what you're thinking. I know we kind of put that question on the table a couple of weeks ago. I'm super curious what's been percolating in your mind, and also as you're doing this.
Yeah, no, really cool. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts so far. And funnily enough, I took some notes before the session. I feel between the two of you, you kind of captured exactly kind of along the lines of what I was thinking too. I think coming back to the first point that you made, Yannick, very much about, as someone who's also doing therapy actively right now, that example I think is so interesting. Something I often feel in therapy, or even when I think about certain friendships, is when you're always the person sharing, but the other person is kind of just being present with you, but for whatever reason, professionally or for personal reasons, not sharing back. Something I've really noticed for myself is as much as that's a pleasant process, that lack of connection in a way that it kind of, or there isn't that mutual reciprocity in connection. So I think, I really agree with the fact that by sharing relevantly, but vulnerably about ourselves in the session, it has that potential to create more connection at that human level. And I think therefore also deepen trust, which I think, especially if this is going to be an ongoing and long-standing relationship, that can be a real benefit. So I think that's the first point that I made, and that's really nice.
Nikki, can I just jump in with something? Just mentioning, I pictured you for a moment being with a client and saying something like, oh yeah, I've been talking about something similar with my therapist recently. Whatever it was, would you disclose that you're in therapy as a coach to a client?
Wow, I mean, that's a whole other good question, isn't it?
Because on the one hand, what's the client's story about that? On the other hand, because it could kind of break some of the trust in some way, depending on what's the client's narrative around therapy. But it also normalizes that people you respect go to therapy. People who seem to hold things down and live a pretty cool life. Nick, I mean, you're doing amazing things, Nick. You're really
thanks, dude.
How you are as a person. But also we all deal with stuff, and therapy is a really helpful process to just kind of clean out the closet, or just, process some things. Everybody's feeling some pretty heavy emotions from time to time, some more, some less, but everybody does. So having a space where we can reflect on what's going on in our life regularly, it's, normalizing something like that can have a huge positive impact on the client, especially if they have a narrative around, or therapies for crazy people who can't cope with life. And then the person that you really respect, your coach that you've been working with for some time, discloses that they go see a therapist. You're like, oh, well, if that person sees a therapist, maybe I can rethink what therapy actually means. Not that that's your agenda, but that's just some of the side effects of self-disclosure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. That could be a really powerful example of self-disclosure with a client. I hadn't actually thought about whether that's something I would bring into a session or not, but I think, it's a bit of an interesting question in its own right. But I like what you said about it there.
Oh, sorry. Good.
Yeah.
I've actually shared that with clients, and I have done. I mean, so I have a coach, a life coach, a business coach, and for the last year and a half, I've been working with a therapist. And I share that, and I often share what you exactly said there. That my idea was that it's usually crazy people or people that are depressed or feeling really down work with a therapist. And it's, I'm not sharing a lot of context just to justify it, but again, like, I share it when I see there's like a relevance to it, when it's useful, right? And personally, it hasn't come up to me. Like, the idea of losing trust hasn't come up to me, but I can see also that people can think about it in a different way, because I used to think about it in a very different way, right? About the like, oh, this person is really struggling, or this person is, really low in their life. But I think something else that I want to bring on this, and I think we come back to you, Nikki, is like, I don't think it's like good or bad. Like, sometimes I think what's happened a little bit in the personal development world, and I think sometimes coaches are influenced by that, is like, you have to like always share your story, always like lead with your story. And I've seen it a lot in the coaching world, like, oh, here's my trauma, here's this and here's that. And an example of it, the therapist is such a great example. Like, I've been working with this amazing therapist, and I don't know much about him, right? And I've seen this with some amazing life and business coaches as well. I'm not saying it's good or bad, because I've seen people that share, like, and they do it in a very balanced way, and they do it in a very professional way, but it creates that deeper connection. And I've seen also that a lot of inexperienced coaches, the way they share it actually, in a way, for me, that kind of puts me off. Like, oh, it's very much like, oh, it's about me, and look, I've done this, so I can do this with you, right? And I think it's just, for me personally, what I would encourage coaches, maybe like, just, I would lean first on the less sharing side, and then really come into like, okay, can I be a bit more vulnerable here? Can I create some more deeper connection? Is this going to be really useful, rather than this whole thing like, you need to lead with your story.
Yeah, and that's the dark side of self-disclosure, I think, because you can get caught up. Like, if you need to know why, that acronym, WAIT, why am I talking? Really good one to reflect on periodically, quite regularly, I'd say. Why am I sharing this? Why am I speaking? Helpful, right? So I do think there's a lot of value in self-disclosure, but absolutely there's a dark side, especially if you find yourself making maybe too many connections between you and others, if you're projecting from what you believe into what others believe. Sometimes when you work with someone who's really very similar to how you are, it might be quite helpful to share some of yourself, right? But if somebody's, on a crude example, just a very cognitive person, and you're quite emotional, just in terms of how you communicate, how you see the world, what you process, then what's going on for you might just really not be very relevant to that person in front of you, because everybody is quite different to you. And so if you tell your story, to what extent is that going to be relevant? And I think a lot of coaches that haven't done a lot of work on themselves, they get that mixed up with best intentions. And so I think we have to be quite careful. And I underline that, Sirvash, maybe start with less and then figure out to what extent can that actually help. Because as a baseline, it's good to focus on the client rather than telling your story and helping other people learn from your experience. But at a masterful level, I did an interview, a podcast on Coaching Uncaged with Robin Shohet, Shohet, formidable supervisor, not a coach, therapist, worked with Peter Hawkins in this halfway house in the 70s, In Love with Supervision. It's a fantastic book. But what Robin does so beautifully is he works with his own emotions. He works with what's going on inside of him, because he often says, well, I don't have access to my client's experience. I only have access to my experience. And if you know yourself super well, and you can distinguish, oh, I'm feeling frustration right now, or I'm feeling impatience, right? I'm being really impatient and frustrated right now. Is that my stuff? Is that because of something that's happening in my life at the moment? My dad was very impatient, so is it just something that's coming from there? Is it the way that that person speaks reminds me of my brother, who I, always dragged everything, or Or is that created in this space here as we are in relation with each other? And if I can distinguish between what's my stuff coming out of my box and what's being created here in this space, if it's created here and I'm unfamiliar with this impatience and this frustration, then chances are this is either being projected into this space from somewhere else or it's somehow generated from the client. Like this is the client stuff. It's my I'm feeling the frustration, but the client is creating it in some way, right? So if I acknowledge my frustration and my impatience, chances are the client can resonate with it. It's like, oh yeah, that's how I feel every single day. Or like, yeah, that's exactly what's going on for me as I'm, you're just naming something that's in the space. It's not necessarily my emotion, even though I'm feeling it, right? And if you name that, you're bringing something in from yourself. It's in a way self-disclosure, but it's a beautiful way of naming something that's currently emerging in the space rather than sharing my emotion, because it might not be my emotion. I'm just feeling it. You know what I mean?
Wow, there was so much in there that I feel like I could go into deeper and unpack. But bringing it back, I mean, I really like that acronym WAIT, and I think everything else that's been said just kind of falls into that. And the other 2 points I was going to make about it, which was, the first of all, as a rule of thumb, I got taught this early on in my coaching training, was, the client should do most of the talking. So yeah, I think sharing is good and relevant for all the reasons we've already said, but always, the focus should remain on and with the client. And I think then the last point comes back into the kind of longer sharing we just had. And that is exactly that question of, why am I sharing this? And coming back to therapy, I think, that's where therapy is so important. And I understand there's still so much stigma around it for some people. It's interesting that in my circles, and I guess I'm surrounded in my day-to-day work with a lot of younger people, it's a standard that people are in therapy now when you speak to anyone, and there's also my perception or belief that I think, anyone in reality probably can benefit from some therapy, certainly at some point in their life. So for me, I don't have that stigma, but yeah, to then have the self-awareness when you are sharing and disclosing to your client, I think the question to ask yourself is, why am I sharing that? And I guess that goes back into WAIT, like, yeah, why am I talking? And, is it an opportunity to get your own validation, or is it really an opportunity to serve the client in some way? Like, yeah, I think this is a general question that I would ask myself when I'm coaching, is like, why did I say that? And hopefully I can do that before I say something or as I'm saying something, rather than just in hindsight. And I think that's where therapy, that self-awareness, can be really helpful for our coaching or as coaches.
Yeah. Oh, I knew there was more than 15 minutes in this, but maybe at this point we can close.
Nice.
Yeah, and just before we close, I think one last thing is, and I don't want to open another box, but
who has the last word?
The last nugget. Go ahead.
But I think actually you opened up another distinction, right? It's around, because initially when we started with the question, I was thinking more about, and I think that's what the person that's asking the question had probably intended, is how much do I disclose of my own stuff, right? But you touch on something else, and I think that's it's a different skill.
What's really
as coaches, we can hold some attention on the inside and really pay attention to like what is coming up in this session, right? Like, for example, if someone is sharing something, I don't know, I remember like years ago, a client shared about, we finished like a 12-month contract, and she was sharing about her new 12-month goals. And I was just like, I felt like I didn't feel much inside. And I just shared it with her, like, hey, as you're sharing, it's very different from how you normally talk about things. I don't feel your heart is into this. You're passionate about this. And then she was like, yeah, you know what? Actually, screw that stuff. That's my parents. That's not what I want. Right? And I wasn't really attached to, and I think it's like not being attached to what we feel is right or wrong, but sometimes that's something else in terms of disclosing what it's like. If we keep some of that intention there might be something else that comes up there when somebody talks about the relationship, their goals. And that I think can be really useful. But I think that's slightly different from the initial question around how much do I share of my own stuff.
Yeah, that's disclosing our experience rather than facts and information about ourselves. Yeah, I remember my very first coach I think my very first session with him. I was just like laying out blah, 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 this context. He asked me a question, and at some point he leaned back and he's like, I don't know, for some reason, I don't quite believe you. I'm like,
Strong.
and I was stumped. And then I had a similar experience. It's like, oh yeah, I think I've been creating a bit of a story here, and I got so used to telling the story that I believed myself. And now that I'm being challenged on it because of that person's experience and rather boldly sharing his experience, allowed me to challenge my story. Very powerful moment. Still remember it very vividly, including
That's
the
bold
room
but
where
powerful.
it happened. Right. Super curious what other people are thinking, other stories of self-disclosure and when it worked and when it backfired. I'd be super interesting to see and hear about. Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your commitment to learning and growing as a coach. Just a few things before you go. First of all, we're doing this for you, so if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, do send us a question. Secondly, we're not doing this for profit, so we rely on your support to help us reach as many coaches as we can. So if you can send this episode to a friend or tell a fellow coach about what we're doing here, maybe you can subscribe or leave us a review, or even support us on Patreon. That would be amazing. And lastly, you can find us across all major platforms. So whether you like to watch or you like to listen or you like to download episodes and listen to it in your car while you're driving through somewhere with no internet, you can do so too. And that's it from us. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.